Hey everyone, so it seemed like everyone liked the initial beta kit reading of Columbina and my initial overview of it and my first impressions. So now since I'm awake and it's a normal time, I thought might as well just do the rest of the two characters that are releasing in Luna 4. So I'm just going to quickly go over Zibai and Illuga, two characters who are going to be introducing the Lunar-Crystallized reaction. Again, yes, I am farming the YouTube algorithm currently for content. We still don't have a lot of numbers, so we don't really know how much damage Zibai is going to do. We don't know how good they actually are. That information will come very soon. And of course, I'll be making a more detailed and edited video on them later. But as for now, just a very informal, not as much edited video of me going over the initial beta kit, reading over it, and just explaining what they generally do. First things first, we should go over what Lunar-Crystallize is. Lunar-Crystallize can be triggered when you have Columbina, Illuga, or Zibai in your party, just any one of them, and it's only when Hydro and Geo interact. If you use any other elements, there will be no Lunar Crystallizations. Now, whether or not it triggers regular Crystallize or doesn't do anything, we are not sure. But Hydro and Geo only is Lunar Crystallization. When you trigger the reaction, you will create 3 lunar wards near the target, and these you can kind of think of as constructs, as for every 3 lunar crystallized reactions you trigger, those wards will resonate, kind of like a Zhongli pillar resonating with that little square aura, and then it will unleash some instances of AoE damage, 1 or 3, currently unclear. I say construct, but we don't really know if they actually count as geo constructs. This is still some unknown information. It probably is, considering, as we'll look into Illuga's kit, if the 3 do count as constructs, it does synergize with Illuga's kit, and it kind of makes sense, but again, we're not sure. It'll be confirmed eventually. And then lastly, the damage of these wards resonating can crit, and it will be calculated similar to lunar charged. That means is that any character that is involved in triggering the reaction, so anyone that applies Hydro or Geo, will take part of the reaction, and their stats will help scale the damage of the reaction. And it will probably be like lunar charge, where the top 2 characters that deal the most damage will probably have their stats taken into account more. So for example, if you have Flynn's, Anetha, and Aino triggering a lunar charge reaction, Anetha and Flynn's stats will be taken more into account for the damage of the lunar charge reaction, and Aino will only count for 1/12 of the damage. So with that out of the way, let's first go over Zibai's kit. She's a Geo Sword user, and she is the Lunar Crystallized main DPS. We can ignore the normal attack, and then for elemental skills. So when you use her elemental skills, she'll enter an enhanced state, Moonshift Interstice, and when she's in her enhanced state, she's going to have infused Geo attacks, and these attacks will generate a resource called Interstice Radiance. And then she can consume Interstice Radiance to unleash a special elemental skill. So if we just skip down over here, you can see that, okay, her normal and charge attacks will get Geo damage infusion, and then after you cast her elemental skill to enter the enhanced state, she'll have another elemental skill, the Starlit Steed Trample. And then when Zibai has 70 of these points, Interstice Radiance, she can consume 70 to cast this special skill damage, and it does 2 instances of damage, and then the second hit is Lunar Crystallization reaction damage. So there's going to be a big source of her damage. Now, how do you gain this resource of Interstice Radiance? You need 70. She can hold 100. So there are a few accumulation methods. First, she just gets 10 per second. Second, when she normal attacks, she gets +5 once per 0.5 seconds. So she wants the normal attack. So you spam normal attacks, and then you'll just eventually get some points. And also, just to add, when you have Ascendant Gleam, her 4th normal attack will also deal damage that's considered Lunar Crystallization reaction damage. So that will probably be a good source of damage as well. And then lastly, if you have Ascendant Gleam, when you trigger Lunar Crystallize, Zibai gains 35 points. And then once you cast 4 of her special elemental skills, or when the duration ends, which is 15 seconds, then the skill is over. So funnily enough, this kit is very similar to Flynn's. You can kind of think of Zibai as Geo Flynn's. So with Flynn's, you just enter his elemental skill state, and then you just spam normal attacks, and then once his special burst is up, you cast special burst 2 times, right? And with Zibai, it's pretty similar. You spam normal attacks on her, and you just gain points, and then once you gain enough points, you cast her special elemental skill. And in this case, you can cast up to 4 times. So this character is very simple. You just enter enhanced state, spam normal attacks until you can press her skill, and then you just keep doing that until you press skill 4 times on her. Then we can move on to her burst. Her burst is very simple. It just does a nuke of damage, and the second hit is considered Lunar Crystallization reaction damage. So unlike Nefer, who doesn't do Lunar Bloom damage of her burst, she actually does do the Lunar Crystallized reaction damage on her burst. So it's going to be useful to use depending on her energy requirements. Maybe she uses it every other, but I'm gonna assume that you probably want to use it every rotation. And then all her passives pretty much just increase her damage. So her special passive is pretty standard for any moon sign DPS, where they increase the base Lunar Crystallized damage by up to 14% based on, in this case, her defense, and of course she counts as +1 moon sign. And then for her other passive, so this first passive, when Zibai casts her Heaven Shift and Silence, which is the skill name, right? Yep, skill name. or when Lunar Ward Resonance is triggered, which is, if you remember, for Lunar Crystallize, you gain the 3 wards, and then after you trigger another 3 Lunar Crystallizes, they'll resonate. So once that happens, she'll gain this buff called Lunar Descent for 4 seconds, and that just increases her Starlit Steed Trample, which is her special skill that you need points for. It gains bonus damage based on her defense, so extra damage for a skill. And then this part we already went over when talking about her skills, so that's pretty much the same. And then lastly, her other passive. For every other party member whose element is Geo, Zibai's defense increases by 15%, and then for every other party member who's Hydro, her elemental mastery increases by 60. So just more buffs for Zibai. So you can clearly see Lunar-Crystallize is going to be defense and EM oriented. And then to quickly go over Constellations, her C1, when she casts her skill, she'll immediately gain 100 of those points to cast the enhanced skill, and then she can cast up to 5 instead of up to 4. So similar to Flynn's C1, where you can cast an extra special burst, well, Zibai can cast an extra special skill with C1. It also increases the first elemental skill damage, which is interesting. C2 buffs her defense while in her enhanced state from an elemental skill, and increases the passive that increases her enhanced skill damage, so more damage. C4 doesn't reset her normal attack combo, which is pretty good if you need to dodge, and remember her 4th normal attack actually does Lunar Crystallize damage. And then when her special skill hits an enemy, the next normal attack does extra Lunar Crystallize damage, more damage. And then C6 increases her interstice radiance accumulation by 4%, so she gains more points. And then instead of just using 70 points to cast her special elemental skill, she consumes all her points, but anything exceeding 70 increases that special skill's damage. And currently I don't see elevation, and they like putting elevation on C6, so I'm gonna assume that this increases the cast damage is actually not damage bonus, it's actually elevation. It probably makes the most sense. It's probably a translation thing, but we'll see. So overall, very simple kit in my opinion. Here's a TLDR made by Prasto via J-Stern mains. This is very helpful if you just want to go over. We can just read over it. Press E to do Geo Infused Normals to get points. Special E when you have 70 out of 100 that does direct Lunar Crystallize damage. N4 does 2 hits with Gleam, one of them direct Lunar Charge Reaction. She does 4 enhanced E in the rotation at C0, but at C1 she does 5. Her burst also does direct Lunar Crystallize damage. And yes, you need Ascendant Gleam, which is 2 moon sign characters in the party. Same thing as Flynn's and Nefer. Next, to quickly go over weapons, we have her signature information, so low base attack but high crit damage. And then special passive increases her defense by 20%, and then after she uses her skill, she gains Lunar Crystallization reaction damage. Pretty simple, it's gonna be this. It gives everything that she wants: crit damage, Lunar Crystallization reaction damage, and defense. As for other weapon options, I kind of just quickly went over, so obviously this is not comprehensive. Uraku Misuguri is probably going to be fine. She does do normal attack and elemental skill damage, so she'll be able to activate it, and she does geo damage obviously, so she gets the defense. Now, most of her damage is Lunar Crystallize reaction damage, which means that this doesn't really do anything, but she does have some normal hits that do normal attack and elemental skill damage, so it's probably going to be fine. And then looking back on it, Jade Cutter is probably going to be okay if you just don't overcap on the crit rate. Stats like crit means that it will actually scale the Lunar Crystallize damage as opposed to this normal damage percent that doesn't do anything. So ton of crit rate is probably good, but you just have to worry about overcapping, which might be a problem. Similarly, Yu-Peng will probably be fine because it gives crit rate, and then since she's on field, her hitting her elemental skill and elemental burst actually means that she gets additional crit rate. And again, like this damage bonus to elemental skill and elemental burst damage doesn't affect the Lunar Crystallize damage, which is probably going to be the most important part of her kit, but the crit rate does. So I think that's going to be good if you get the battle pass. And then for free to play weapons, the Notlan Craftable is probably going to be fine, just gives a ton of defense. It gives even more defense after using her elemental skill, so pretty straightforward. And lastly, for artifact sets, I think this is very straightforward. Night of the Skies Unveiling, this is from nod-krai main DPS. She's a nod-krai main DPS. Next, let's go over Illuga, which is the 4-star character that is probably releasing with Zibai because he is a Geo polearm user and he is a support. Not necessarily specifically for Lunar Crystallize, but definitely very good for Lunar Crystallize. His elemental skill spawns a bird Adong and it pretty much just does damage. I don't really see much else it does. 15-second cooldown just for particles, so we can just gloss over that. His main stuff is in his elemental burst. So when he uses his elemental burst, does AoE geo damage and then grants this buff called Nightingale's Nocturne for 20 seconds. And then this buff gives him 21 stacks of Nightingale's Song, and these 21 stacks increases the geo damage of the active party member. So whether they do normal attack, charge attack, plunging attack, elemental skill, elemental burst, basically anything increases their damage. So 21 stacks is probably just going to be a normal quill buff like Shenhe quills or Llama quills from her burst, and each attack will consume 1 stack, and then it will scale off of Illuga's elemental mastery. And then if the damage is a Lunar Crystallize reaction damage, then the increase is further enhanced. So this is why not necessarily specifically for Lunar Crystallize, but if you do play with a Lunar Crystallize Lunar-Crystallize DPS, aka Zibai, you'll get much more out of Illuga. And then stacks are consumed based on enemies hit, so AoE consumes more stacks. And then additionally, if Illuga casts his burst while there are geo constructs nearby, you will gain more stacks. So instead of 21, each construct will give you plus 5 stacks, up to 15 stacks per burst. Now this is the reason why we're not 100% sure that the normal Lunar-Crystallize reaction, which creates wards that resonate, count as constructs, because it's not confirmed yet, but it does suggest that it does, because if you trigger normal Lunar-Crystallize and it creates 3 wards, well, that just perfectly maxes Illuga's buff and it gives you the 15 stacks plus the 21 stacks. Again, not 100% confirmed, but my guess is that the normal Lunar-Crystallize reaction spawns wards that do count for this, and you'll get the total of the 36 stacks from Illuga's burst. So pretty much, yes, he's a buffer, and he gives even more buffs with his passives. So his first passive, after he uses Dawn Breaking Messenger or Light Unshadowed, which is either his skill or burst, then nearby other party members will gain 5% crit rate to their geo damage and 10% crit damage to their geo damage, so that's cool. And if you have Ascended Gleam, they will also gain 50 EM. Then the next passive enhances his elemental burst buff, so if the party contains 1, 2, or 3 Hydro or Geo characters excluding him, then the geo damage increase is increased more by his elemental mastery, and the Lunar Crystallization reaction damage is increased more by his elemental mastery. So as you can see, the Lunar Crystallize is very heavily toward just Hydro and Geo characters, so you can kind of think of it as a Skirk team, where Skirk really just wants Hydro and Cryo. And while this is arguably not as restrictive as that, you ideally just want Hydro and Geo characters on Zibai and Illuga's teams. And from this, I don't see him counting as +1 moon sign. I don't know if this is missing. Maybe he just doesn't. I feel like he should, because he has all this normal Ascendant Gleam. I think he should have +1 moon sign, maybe it's just not written. Now also reading this, it doesn't read that he enables Lunar Crystallize by himself. So if I just look at what's on his passives written down here, you need Zibai or Columbina. But if I go over to this Lunar Crystallization clarification, it does say or Illuga in this party. So a little bit of conflicting information of whether he'll enable Lunar Crystallize on his own. That's the nature of like this very early information. That's why this is very subject to change, obviously. I think a good assumption is that he doesn't. I feel like HOYOverse is going to keep in tradition with 4 stars not enabling lunar reactions, but we shall see. Then we can quickly go over Constellations. C1, when geo reactions are triggered, he restores energy, so decreases ER requirements. That's cool. With C2, after every 7 of his bursts quill stacks are consumed, he does extra damage. That's cool. C4, while his burst is active, the active character gets 200 defense. That's cool. And then C6 enhances his passive buff. So instead of gaining 5% and 10% crit rate and crit damage, the geo damage will get 10% crit rate and 30% crit damage, and as well as 80 EM instead of 50 AM. So C6, obviously they gotta make it very strong. So again, here is a TLDR of his kit made by Prasa from J-Star Main, so very helpful of him. We'll just go over it really quickly. E summons dragon, or just, does damage. Q gives 21 kill oils plus 5 per construct, up to plus 15, but not sure if Lunar Crystallize is a construct. He buffs geo damage, 5% crit rate, and then 10% crit damage, but 10% crit rate or 30% crit damage with C6, and then plus 50 EM with Ascendant Gleam, or if it's going to be 80 EM with Ascendant Gleam. And then the quill buffs are increased based on Illuga's EM, but if you do Lunar Crystallize, it's maybe way more, so definitely very Lunar Crystallize support coded. C1 extra energy, C2 more damage, C4 extra buff, and then C6 are these extra buffs. As for a very quick, definitely not comprehensive weapon choice options, Contain Crossbeard looks fine. It gives EM substat, and then it gives him pretty much energy from the special passive, which helps him cast his burst, so that would be very useful. And then Dragon's Vein might also be useful. The special passive doesn't really matter, but it just gives more EM as a substat, which increases his buff. But this is assuming you meet his energy requirements and the team doesn't need energy. And then lastly, of course, Favonius Lance. I doubt that a support character will not be able to use this. I think this would probably be very good on him. Lastly, for artifacts, I think he is the Silken Moon Serenade user for Zibai. If we consider Zibai uses the DPS nod-krai set, someone's got to use the support set, and I think Columbina will probably want the new Columbina set, so that probably leaves him to be a good user of this, considering he doesn't do damage, so the 2-piece just being energy recharge is fine and just helps you activate the 4-piece buff for this for the team. But if there's another teammate that can better use Silken Moon Serenade, then maybe Illuga just holds 2-piece EM just to stack more EM so his buff increases. So that's just my very quick and dirty overview and first impressions on Zibai and Illuga. At the time I'm recording, we don't know any numbers, so we don't know how strong this team is going to be. As for the actual team building, it's going to be Zibai, Illuga, and then Columbina is going to fit in there, obviously, because she's going to be the best lunar support for Hydro. Otherwise, you probably use Ino. And then for the last slot, it's going to be a little bit of a mix-up. You could just use Columbina and Ino. You can maybe use Columbina and then another Hydro unit as well. Or you can use Columbina, maybe Zhongli, because this team technically doesn't have any sustain in it. So if you really want to sustain, you either go Hydro Healer or Zhongli. And for those of you asking for Shallonen, Shallonen just doesn't work if you do triple Geo. Like, she doesn't give any res shred, so no, you can't use Shallonen. Other than that, I think this team seems pretty simple. Zibai is very similar to Flynn's playstyle. You just spam normal attacks and spam the special skill when their thing is up. I think team building will be simple, not too much variance. So if you didn't pull any nod-krai main, any lunar main DPSs while on your way to Columbina and you want one and she looks interesting, then she'll probably be fine. But of course, this is very early information on both Zibai and Illuga. We'll get more numbers and clarification soon, and I'll definitely make more detailed and edited and proper videos later on. But otherwise, hope you enjoyed this very initial first impressions on their kits, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.